18, we're here for chapter 7 of Bloom. When her alarm went, Anaya slapped it silent, then dragged herself out of bed. The smell of coffee and toast lingered in the quiet house. Mom had just left, and Dad had gone even earlier. He'd woken her to say goodbye before setting off for the eco-reserves by boat with Emmett. He'd sat on the edge of her bed with his warm earth smell. She told him she was going to miss him, told him to be safe, and he'd be back in a couple of days, and not to worry. She felt miserable when he left, but she drifted back to sleep anyway. On her way to the bathroom, Anaya glimpsed the latest crop of black grass, already 4 feet tall on the front lawn. "Hate you," she muttered. She dressed for school and went downstairs. She microwaved an apple, poured some almond milk into a bowl of gluten-free granola, ate. "Don't worry," Dad had said. How could you not worry when terrible bioengineered plants were taking over the planet? She dropped her apple core into the compost and saw that the bag was almost overflowing. Knotting it, she carried it out through the back door. The bins were against the wall, around the corner from the driveway. Anaya dumped the compost into the stinky green bin and clasped the lid. From the garbage bin next to it came a dry rustling sound, like something scratching inside. When the bin shuddered, Anaya stepped back. Probably a squirrel in there. When the sound came again, it was more like a snake's hiss. There weren't rattlesnakes on the island, she knew that much. She grabbed the rake leaning against the wall. With the tines, she carefully slipped open the lid. Gripping the rake in both hands like a baseball bat, she retreated a few steps and waited for something to jump out. When nothing appeared, she whacked the side of the bin. After waiting a few more seconds, she stepped closer and peeped inside. In an explosion of hissing and whirling, a long, dark snake churned frantically against the sides, trapped. With a cry, Anaya kicked the bin. It toppled into the driveway, spilling a thick tangle onto the asphalt. It took her several seconds to realize it wasn't a snake. It was a black vine twisted into knots and still moving. Anaya brought down the rake's sharp teeth on it, severing the vine again and again until it stopped writhing. Panting, she shoved the tangled mess away from her. She bent closer and with a chill realized it looked a lot like the vine Dad had been growing on the farm. Same color, same little bulges along the stem. Only this vine was much bigger and longer. Had it grown from the water puddled at the bottom of the garbage bin? From a careful distance, she bent in to look. Light slanted through a crack in the plastic bottom. Anaya spotted the vine growing through it. Growing out, or growing in. She walked around the outside of the bin and followed the vine down the driveway. It was very well camouflaged against the asphalt. She figured she must be tracing the vine to its source because it was getting thicker. Then she stopped and stared. It had grown from the bag of soil she'd taken from the school field. She'd left it propped up against the wall because Dad had someone from the farm who would swing by to pick it up. It looked a lot fatter than she remembered. A single thick vine had grown from the top of the bag and split into 3. One had grown down the driveway and into the garbage can, and the other two vines had climbed halfway up the wall of the house. Dangling from one of them was a kind of wrinkly sack. Anaya stared at it. It looked like those bulges she and Dad had noticed at the lab, only much bigger. Right above the sack was a sprig of dark berries. They were small and smooth, and Anaya was startled by how she wanted to pluck one. She could almost feel the firmness of it against her tongue and imagine its taste singing through her mouth. She took a step closer, hand outstretched. A tiny bird landed on the vine and cocked its head at the berries. It took one in its beak and tugged. The berry didn't want to come off. The bird was perched atop the wrinkly sack. As Anaya watched, the bird plucked harder. The berry popped off, and at that exact moment, the sack opened like fleshy lips. Before the bird could spread its wings, it tumbled inside. Anaya made a small, startled grunt. The sack shook as the bird chirped and struggled, but the space was too narrow for it to open its wings. An odd cloying smell reached Anaya's nostrils. Already the wet lips of the sack were closing. From inside, the bird's muffled shrieks suddenly stopped. A terrible smell of something rotten came from the sack. Anaya stepped back, breathing hard. Her gaze slithered back down the vine to the bag of soil. Heart pounding, Anaya opened up the bag and looked inside. The soil trembled. A tiny hole, like the one a clam makes in the sand, appeared. Some of the grains of earth slipped into it. Anaya caught another whiff of that same sweet perfume, only stronger. Her mouth was dry with fear as she got the rake. Lightly, she tapped the soil with the end of the handle. The entire bag shook violently as a hole opened up in the middle. The handle of the rake fell deeper inside, and a fleshy mouth clamped shut around it. With a holler, Anaya pulled back on the rake. In a cascade of soil, the bag tipped over, and a huge, wrinkly sack tumbled out. It was a dark purple, and still clamped around the handle, trying desperately to devour it. Near the school, Petra passed an orange-vested work crew with chainsaws hacking down the black grass along the road. She cut through the tall cedars that bordered one side of the playing field and recognized the gawky outline of Seth Robertson leaning against a tree. She started to change course. She talked to him just yesterday and didn't want him to think she was a stalker, but he turned and saw her. His smile of greeting was so eager and genuine, she couldn't help feeling touched. He waved. "Hi," she said, walking over. In his cupped hand were some berries. He popped one into his mouth. There was a dribble of juice on his chin. She didn't want to embarrass him by pointing it out, and seeing it made her less nervous somehow. Like she could just be herself, which was such a relief. "Are those blueberries?" she asked. "Don't know." She laughed. "How can you not know?" He shrugged. "They're really addictive. I saw a bunch on my way to school." He nodded at the tree. "There's some here, too." Petra looked and saw a sprig of berries growing from the trunk at eye level. She frowned. Did berries grow right from the bark? They were deep purple, so dark they were almost black. They did look awfully good. She reached out for one and noticed that they weren't growing from the tree at all. They came from a vine that snaked cleverly through the crevices in the bark. With a chill, she realized the vine was the same disconcerting color as the black grass and the other plants that had grown in the bottles. "Stop eating them," she told Seth. "They might be poisonous." "Hey, look," someone called out near the school. "A deer." Petra turned. A fawn had wandered into the middle of the school field. It bent its dappled neck and began eating grass. It wasn't the first time. Lately, they'd gotten pretty bold. Mr. Hilborn always drove them off, but Petra felt sorry for them. There was so little proper grass now. Against the back wall of the school, near the picnic tables, Petra saw a bunch of kids watching the deer, the smokers. They were pretty much the only people who lingered outside these days. She recognized Jen Richards and Teresa, who did yearbook with Anaya, and her boyfriend, Fleetwood, who looked an awful lot like Jefferson, the cute, shaggy guy on that surfing show. "Oh my God," Teresa cried out suddenly, dropping her cigarette and running into the field. Petra's gaze whipped back to the deer. Its rear half had disappeared into the earth. Pawing frantically at the grass, its neck and shoulders straining, it struggled to haul itself out of the hole. Its eyes were huge and white with shock. A terrible, high-pitched squeal welled from its throat as it slipped back even deeper. "We've got to help it," she gasped, and she was already running, Seth right behind her. She reached the deer first. It was still flailing, trying to climb out of the hole, but the sides of the hole weren't dirt. Petra stared in incomprehension. What was that? The walls of the hole were slick and faintly purple, with a fleshy rim around the top that was starting to flex and slowly contract. Petra couldn't see the deer's hindquarters because the hole narrowed and curved at the bottom. A sickly perfume wafted up. She thought she heard a faraway voice shouting, "Don't move, guys, stay still." "Let's pull it out," panted Teresa, who'd just arrived with Fleetwood and Jen. The deer suddenly collapsed, legs twisted under. It wailed piteously from the bottom of the hole. The smell of garbage cans on a hot day rose up. Then the top began to contract, like a set of hideous lips mashing together. "Don't move," came the shout again, louder now, and Petra wrenched her gaze away to see Anaya hurrying toward them along the very edge of the field. In her hands was a chainsaw. Don't move, she bellowed. The field's not safe. Seth watched Anaya crossing the field, one careful step at a time. The ground could cave in, she cried. Seth stared at the sealed-over hole, which was shuddering as the deer kicked from inside. What is this thing? He heard Petra shout, like it was all Anaya's fault. A plant, Anaya said. A plant? Teresa looked like she was on the verge of panic. It just ate a freaking deer, Fleetwood said. There could be more of them, Anaya yelled. Lots more. Seth wished she hadn't said that. Teresa and the others looked even more freaked out now. His own heartbeat was loud in his ears. He tasted the berry juice in his mouth and felt a weird rush of energy. Hey, what's going on? Seth glanced back to the school. Mr. Hilburn was doing his angry gym teacher walk toward them. What are you guys doing in my field now? He hollered. Mr. Hilburn, stay there, Anaya shouted. Please, it's not safe. He kept coming. What's with the chainsaw, Miss Riggs? From behind, Anaya, a large, orange-vested worker, came stomping after her, glaring. Hey, young lady, I need that chainsaw back right now. Seth turned to Anaya. You know how to use that thing? Of course I do, she said. That was good, Seth thought, because he had an overwhelming sense that something terrible was about to happen, and the loudest thought in his head was, keep them safe, Anaya and Petra, keep them safe. Stop, Anaya shouted to the worker, and then to Mr. Hilburn. There's things under the ground. Nobody run, Seth said to the other kids, and hoped they'd listen. If it can eat a deer, it can eat us, Teresa said, and grabbed Fleetwood's hand. Is that another hole? Said Mr. Hilburn, squinting in annoyance, or maybe it was confusion, as he kept coming. What have you guys... The earth opened up under him. He fell down to his armpits, scrambling to the ground. Then his head kicked back as he was pulled completely out of sight. Seth looked at the others and could tell Teresa was about to bolt. He saw in her eyes. Anaya must have seen it too, because she said, Teresa, don't. It all happened in a matter of heartbeats. Teresa ran for the school. Fleetwood charged after her, calling, Teresa, this way, it's safer, then veered off toward the road. Seth wasn't sure Teresa had even heard him because she didn't stop or change course. After 4 strides, Fleetwood looked back over his shoulder, shouted at Teresa again, and then the earth swallowed him whole. No, Seth heard Anaya gasp. She dropped the chainsaw and chased after Teresa. Teresa, stop, she bellowed. Seth was about to sprint after her when Petra snatched up the chainsaw and ran in a different direction. Petra, he shouted. She kept going. He looked at Anaya running and Petra running. How could he keep them both safe? He took off after Petra. 6 strides ahead of him, she plunged through the earth down to her shoulders. Seth threw himself to the ground and reached out. Her hands clasped his. Pull me, she wailed. I'm trying, he hollered. He kicked himself into sitting and leaned back with all his weight. His muscles felt strong, but not strong enough. Petra sank deeper, pulling him with her. He could have let go, but he didn't. His teeth clenched, and he let himself fall into the hole with her. End of chapter 7.